Well, I'll say a few things about Trump and trade. I mean, in my view, this is a huge change in trade policy in the U.S. I don't have the skill set to discuss why. I mean, this probably requires a different skill set, but we can discuss what are the consequences and how did we end up here. And what I'll do is first I'll discuss how did we end up where we are, and it's for Damien especially and David to discuss the consequences of the current trade policy. So why do I say change? Well, I was looking at the U.S. history and participation in the WTO since 1947, and there are only the apex, let's say, of threat, not to quit, of threat to unilateralism by the U.S. is 1971 with the Nixon shock, the first one, and the second one, Reagan in the 80s. But none of them had anything to do with what we live nowadays. I mean, the Nixon shock is a response to a very idiosyncratic set of circumstances. Clearly transitional duties, they were removed later. And Reagan upset, I mean, he had this famous phrase, we're trade partners, not trade patches. Very upset with policies of India, Brazil, and so on concerning services and IP. He moves into some sort of unilateral action, Section 301. But again, never a threat to quit the GATT. Eventually prepared to negotiate his Section 301 against enhanced multilateral disciplines. This, what we live now, is something totally different. So, threat to quit, what is the first question? And quite frankly, I mean, this is a WTO construct. The GATT WTO was created by the US. It's a transatlantic agreement between the US and the UK for all practical purposes. It's an agreement aimed to dismantle tariff protection in the 40s, which was the main market segmenting factor. Instruments to safeguard the trade promise, which don't go very far when it comes to, let's say, behind the border barriers, precisely because this is a homogeneous construct. It's only Western countries that negotiate the GATT. And the US, showing leadership in the 40s, is prepared to take a little bit of a dent on its trade interests by accepting, for example, in the name of geopolitics or the threat of communism, Ben Stiles' 2018 book, accepting less than a perfect reciprocity from the UK. The UK never, in the 40s at least, much later, yes, abandoned its imperial preferences, the quid pro quo for the US. So they accepted that. They said, well, my duty as a leader, because Del Hall went on record a number of times, my duty as a leader is to accept some sort of a slack here because I'm buying goodwill, I'm buying cooperation, and I'm going to install a system that will benefit everybody. Now, this is the GATT in the 40s, and from GATT in the 40s to today's world, the US again has been instrumental in reducing tariff barriers. The biggest success of the GATT is enhanced membership, new agreements, behind the border agreements. We don't change the recipe, we keep it negative integration. We don't want to interfere with domestic policies. Again, precisely because there is no major threat. There are no non-market economies entering the GATT. Those who entered are minor players, Poland, Hungary, Romania. And anyway, all of them eventually they joined the European Union, which is much more of a safe box than the GATT. So we stick to the formula, we liberalize trade, US instrumental in liberalizing trade, adding agreements, and the culmination point, compulsory third-party adjudication. This is the only regime in the world where you have, there's nothing like I don't like you, I nuke you. I don't like you, we go to a court. For any other dispute, you establish a court only upon consensus by the defendant, not for trade. Now, there is an inflection point eventually, and that's the accession of China. China is different in many ways. China is difficult to qualify the regime, but let's use for now socialist market economy of a huge size. There's nothing like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, the previous countries that entered the GATT. Russia negotiates after China, and Russia is post-communism Russia, not that Russia is a market economy. So China is the inflection point. Something changes with China. We have an agreement in place, the Uruguay Round agreements, which, again, as I said before, they don't put into question behind the border policies too much. And against this background, the European Union and the US negotiate a protocol with China, which was supposed to complement the existing agreements. Now, this protocol has a number of provisions concerning market opening measures, trading rights, reduction of export duties, and so on and so forth. But the key questions were not addressed. This is not the fault of China. There is no coordination between the EU and the US. They negotiate separately, and both negotiate based on their own trade interests. Actually, if you go back, I had to go back because of this talk to look a little bit, how did politicians view this negotiation back at the end of the 90s? You cannot believe what you look. I mean, we can give names later, they are on public record. Serious guys, big names, saying, well, China by definition in the next 10 years is a market economy. To other guys saying China will disintegrate as a result of trade liberalization, blah, 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 blah. So China enters the WTO. I didn't see between 1995 and 2001, when China enters, until now, the US being upset with anything in particular. The US participates in WTO negotiations, is a heavy user of dispute settlement. Percentage-wise, wins many more claims, close to 10% more than the mean, above the mean. The US does not do much. The WTO did not manage to produce any multilateral agreement after 1995, except for minor things like aid for trade and maybe not so minor trade facilitation. Maybe I'm a bit unfair here. The US participated in all of this, did not do as much as I think it could have done to promote the agenda, but did not threaten to leave either, and was quite present in a number of negotiations. Chorus, Korea-US, TPP, TTIP, TISA, the biggest agreement on services. And then, what? Well, and then a halt. The Trump administration comes into place. There are direct threats towards the WTO. For example, dispute settlement. They refuse to renew judges. We went from 7 to 3 judges. One of the 3 is the former Chinese lawyer of MOFCOM. She's conflicted in a number of cases. God knows what will happen in the months to come, how they will judge, because they will be left with 2 judges for a number of cases. They disrespect the most basic WTO promises. Duties have been raised unilaterally in the name of national security, but quite frankly, you buy this, you believe in Santa Claus as well. But of course, the US continues to submit disputes up to a certain point. Bilateral, plurilateral deals, they are out from everything. They left TPP, they left TTIP, TTIP is dead, TISA is frozen. They signed USMCA, which sounds like Chewbacca from Star Wars. I mean, and if you look at the content of USMCA, quite frankly, I don't understand what was all this fuss about. Everybody who is an expert in the field of investment explained to me it's one step back and not one step forward. And we are at a situation where I don't know if the US has checked out or if the US is about to check out from the WTO, which, as I said before, is the country most responsible for bringing about. The last thing I will say, I did not exceed my time, no? I'm doing fine?
Go ahead,
yeah?
you're fine.
I wonder if Cordell Hull was around, how would he feel? He must have vilified at least. I mean, if I were Cordell Hull, how would I feel about what's happening now? Now, what is the US attitude in the WTO? Maybe the US implicit assumption is WTO cannot deal with China. That's fine. But it's unclear if the argument is we don't have enough agreements or the agreements we have are not being enforced. I don't know what is. It is unclear where the US stands. I have my views, but these are my views, not the USTR views. There is also the view that the WTO runs against the US interests. I mean, this is also quite clear. I mean, they come up with strong statements. The judiciary disrespects the US rights. The judiciary takes too much time, quite frankly. I mean, if you look at the appellate body of the WTO, they have to do disputes within 90 days. If you take out 2 or 3 outliers, they did all cases until a year ago, when they're left down to 3 people, in 90 days, in less than 90 days, actually. Now, how many court of appeals you know that resolve disputes in 90 days? it's not very persuasive to me. There is something else. Now, what is the something else? Quite frankly, I don't know, because every time I try to reason, I look at the equilibrium path before us. I say, wait, what explains the US? I cannot come up with any persuasive explanation. If the US wants to be isolationist totally, why did they sign NAFTA? The USMAC, sorry. I mean, either you are here or you're not. If they want to address China, does it make sense to address China by yourself? Or would you rather have the WTO membership behind you? Does it make sense? And what I fear is that they might push some big players. The EU is the first who is going in this direction towards making bilateral deals with China. And then we have to wait and see what was the cost of this trade policy. Not stop here.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you. Merit?
Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to take a somewhat different view than Petros, and I appreciate that we may all kind of be pivoting our approaches in light of your very interesting remarks. So I think, you know, that the period between 1947, 1946, when the GATT was formed to maybe I'd say the high water mark of creating a multilateral framework was 1994. But even at the very beginning, you know, there was trepidation in the United States about how binding should the international rule framework be. So, you know, it was the United States, it was Cordell Hull, it was the State Department that had a vision of an international trade organization that would be far more expansive than what it turns out our Congress would tolerate. And so we ended up with a treaty of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade without an international trade organization, and then a series of tariff reductions that you know, were negotiated bilaterally and then bound multilaterally. And I say that just because sometimes people think that bilateralism is sort of new. In fact, I would say bilateralism is always, you know, it was the pre-war characteristic of the treaty framework. It was embedded into a multilateral framework of the GATT. And over successive rounds of trade talks, more liberalization of tariffs, and then finally with the Uruguay round going much further. But there's always been, I think, a view in the United States, in some quarters, that these frameworks that international trade was important for peace and security, that it was an instrument of peace and security, but some anxiety and antipathy about international rule frameworks constraining the United States from using its own economic power to get the best outcomes for the United States. So I would say that strain has been with us always. And then how did we get the WTO formed? Well, I think there you expanded the agenda, and then you hardened the rules and created a two-tier system of binding dispute settlement. Countries signed on to that, I think, because they saw it as an instrument also of constraining U.S. lateralism. I remember being at USTR, and many countries thought without that the U.S. wouldn't be able to do 301 anymore because there was binding multilateral dispute settlement. And in fact, that has proven to be the case. And many of the people at the time who are now in government, or a few, in particular Ambassador Lighthizer, I think were always concerned that the multilateral framework dispute settlement system would be constraining U.S. unilateralism. And that if it was underperforming, that would be difficult to deal with. And so I guess all of that I say to say that while I agree with you that the US was the architect of the system, pushed the boundaries of this system, there's also been concern about whether this constrained US action. When I was on the appellate body, I would often talk to anti-global groups and say to them, you know, this was not, you created this rule framework not as an abdication of sovereignty, but as an exercise of sovereignty, because there are so many issues that you cannot deal with acting alone. There are externalities of national policies that affect each other. They can't solve by themselves, so you need a multilateral rule framework to address those problems. I think it is being called into question more now than it as at this moment, but it with some unique peculiarities of this administration, of course. So I just say let's not ignore our own history when thinking about the multilateral evolution. I think the biggest departures in U.S. policy now are with respect to the multilateral rule framework and with respect to China. So, you know, there was a view, maybe you call it the liberal trade theorists, that thought that once China joined the WTO and the international system, you know, there would be changes to its model of governance and economic reform that would inexorably lead towards something more like us. I personally never felt that to be the case, and I felt that was, but that wasn't a reason not to have China in. I think the integration of China into the international trading system has many positive consequences for global growth, for China, and for the United States. But there has been a significant slowing of reform in the aftermath, particularly of the Great Recession, and there has been retrenchment politically, and there has been many changes that are a result of a combination of globalization and international trade that have produced severe dislocations in advanced countries, including in the United States, that have not been remedied by national economic policies. And I expect my economist colleagues will speak to that. But so when you have these structural changes in manufacturing and now increasingly in robotics and automation and AI, et cetera, creating economic insecurity, I feel all of these things are coming together to influence how we're thinking about some of the flashpoints in the international trading system. So, and what does the WTO do about that? I think the answer is not very much. I mean, there's a very important protocol of accession. We could talk about that. It was the most ambitious one of any developing country. There have been many reforms introduced in China as a result, but there are areas, particularly with respect to state-owned enterprises, subsidies, and we could point to other areas that are not finding forms of resolution in the multilateral or the bilateral framework. So let me just say that what are the newest features of this administration is to think that deficits are a barometer of the health of a bilateral trade relationship. That to me does not make economic sense, and certainly in the face of US macro policy is unlikely to be a successful strategy for this administration. The use of bilateral tools to try and get concessions like 301, again, to me that's hearkening back to the 80s. The use of 232, a national security instrument around sectors like steel and autos, auto parts, that too is obviously objectively a novel strategy. So let me just say that I guess in light of all of this, I would say the idea that you aggressively use the bilateral tools that you have is not new. Concern about creating too tight a multilateral rule architecture, again, not new. Bilateral trade deficits as something important, fundamentally flawed thinking that is particular to this administration. And let me just say one thing on dispute settlement. It's not clear to me whether this administration wants the dispute settlement system to fall apart or fundamentally is willing to have it be reformed and go forward. In the GATT period, panel reports had to be accepted by the parties to the dispute before they went forward and became binding. Now, panel and appellate body reports are almost automatically adopted. So the parties have lost control over the process, if you will. And that, I think, is something this administration wants to roll back. Now, they say they're prepared to engage on reform of the WTO and the dispute settlement system, but then they say things like, we're prepared to engage if the appellate body will apply the rules as written. Well, how do you get a kind of a priori clarity on what that means? Petros spoke to 90 days. The issues under dispute about the appellate body, some are procedural, some are substantive, and some are really how the whole system operates. I think the procedural ones can be fixed. I think the substantive ones will be much harder, will require the members to go much further into a discussion about trade remedies and subsidies and issues like that. And the systemic ones are also very hard. So in the near term, and we have a crisis near term, because we have only 3 members to retire at the end of 2019. There are conflicts in the system, as you've alluded to. So what are we supposed to do? If we can't take a case to an appellate body, what happens? I guess we're just left with a panel report. And maybe that's what the US wants. It's just not clear.